I still remember the morning the city inspector looked at my neighbor, glanced at the giant metal housing bolted to the outside wall of my bedroom, and said, "I've seen a lot of bad decisions over the years, but this one's going to be expensive." 10 days later, every bolt was gone, every pipe had been ripped out, and the man who once laughed in my face wouldn't even make eye contact anymore. But none of that happened because I screamed louder than he did. It happened because I learned a long time ago that people who believe rules don't apply to them usually end up introducing themselves to someone whose entire job is enforcing those rules. My name's Ethan Walker, and until last spring I lived a pretty forgettable life in a quiet row of townhomes just outside Portland, Oregon. The place wasn't fancy. It had been built back in the early 80s with thick concrete firewalls separating each unit, small fenced patios, and neighbors who mostly respected each other's space. We weren't close enough to borrow sugar from one another, but we waved when we got the mail, helped shovel snow in the winter, and generally understood the unwritten agreement that made neighborhoods work. Leave people alone unless they ask for help. I liked that kind of life. I worked as a commercial estimator for a construction company, spent most weekends restoring an old fishing boat with my brother Caleb, and enjoyed coming home to a house that was, above everything else, quiet. Silence became something I valued. After my wife passed away 5 years earlier, the house echoed differently after that. And somewhere along the way, I realized peace wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of unnecessary conflict. Then Mason and Brooke Dalton bought the unit next door, and that peace lasted exactly 12 days. You know how sometimes you meet someone and within 30 seconds your instincts whisper that you're probably going to have problems? Mason had that effect on almost everybody. He was in his mid-40s, always dressed like he was filming a real estate commercial, expensive sunglasses even when the sky was cloudy, spotless white sneakers that somehow never touched dirt, and a habit of explaining things nobody had asked him to explain. He owned a residential remodeling company, which was perfectly fine, except he carried himself like the entire neighborhood should feel grateful he had chosen to improve it with his presence. The first afternoon after moving in, he leaned over the fence while I was trimming a rose bush. "We're going to transform this place," he said with a grin that somehow felt more like a warning than a conversation. I smiled politely and said, "As long as everything stays on your side, I don't think we'll have any issues." He chuckled, pointed at the property line between us, and said something I didn't think much about at the time. Property lines are mostly just suggestions. Man, good neighbors know how to share. Then he laughed like he'd told the funniest joke in the world. I laughed too, mostly because I assumed nobody actually believed something that ridiculous. Looking back now, I think that was my first mistake. Over the next couple of weeks, contractors came and went from dawn until dusk. Dumpsters arrived, concrete trucks backed into the driveway. The smell of fresh lumber and wet cement drifted through my kitchen windows almost every afternoon. They were putting in an elaborate backyard with a custom swimming pool, outdoor kitchen, lighting system, waterfalls. The kind of project that probably cost more than my truck. I didn't care. It was their money. If they wanted to build a resort behind their townhouse, that wasn't my business. The only thing I noticed was Mason constantly wandering a little farther than he should whenever workers were measuring or digging. Every now and then, I'd catch him standing inside my side yard looking around like he was evaluating it for future improvements. I'd clear my throat. He'd apologize with a grin, then casually wander back without acting embarrassed. My brother Caleb came over one Saturday to help me replace a section of deck railing. He watched Mason giving instructions to half a dozen contractors before quietly saying, "That guy thinks confidence and permission are the same thing." I laughed because it sounded funny, but Caleb rarely misread people. 2 weeks later, I came home after spending the day reviewing a warehouse renovation project, unlocked my front door, and immediately stopped walking. At first, I thought a low-flying airplane was passing overhead. The entire living room carried a deep mechanical hum that I could actually feel through the hardwood floor. My coffee mug sitting on the kitchen counter had tiny ripples dancing across the surface. One of the framed family photos hanging near the hallway was vibrating just enough to tap lightly against the wall every few seconds. I stood perfectly still, listening, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Then I walked through the house, opened the back patio door, and honestly just froze. Mounted directly against the outside wall of my bedroom was a huge gray fiberglass equipment housing nearly the size of a refrigerator. Thick blue PVC pipes disappearing underground toward Mason's new swimming pool. 4 heavy steel anchor bolts had been drilled straight into the masonry of my home, and the entire wall was trembling with every pulse of the industrial pump running inside the enclosure. I remember blinking several times because my brain simply refused to accept what my eyes were looking at. Nobody, absolutely nobody, could possibly think it was acceptable to bolt commercial mechanical equipment directly onto someone else's house without asking. And yet, there it was, humming away like it belonged there. I stared at those bolts for a few more seconds before turning around and walking calmly toward Mason's front door. I wasn't angry yet. I was too confused to be angry. That part would come soon enough. Mason opened the door wearing mirrored sunglasses even though the sun had already started dropping behind the rooftops. He looked at me for maybe 2 seconds before following my eyes toward the backyard, then smiled as if he'd already rehearsed this conversation. "Pretty impressive, isn't it?" he said. I stared at him, honestly waiting for the punchline that never came. "You bolted equipment onto my house," I said as calmly as I could. "No. We mounted the pump enclosure against a solid wall," he corrected, waving his hand dismissively. "Your side just happened to make more sense structurally." I actually laughed once because I couldn't believe those words had come out of another grown man's mouth. "That's my wall, Mason." He shrugged. "It's a shared firewall. It's basically the same thing." "No, it isn't. Come on, Ethan. Don't be one of those neighbors." That sentence stuck with me because it was carefully designed to make me feel unreasonable for objecting to something that was obviously unreasonable. People like Mason have a way of reframing reality until you're expected to apologize for noticing it. I looked him straight in the eye and asked one simple question. "Did you ask me before drilling into my house?" His smile faded for the first time. I didn't think it was necessary. There it was. The truth, delivered with complete confidence. He genuinely believed permission was optional whenever it inconvenienced him. I looked past him toward the backyard where a couple of contractors were pretending not to listen. "How many holes did you drill?" I asked. "Don't worry about it." "How many?" he sighed dramatically. 8 anchors. Heavy duty. It'll outlast both of us." Then he smiled again. "You'll get used to the vibration." I nodded once, turned around, and walked home without another word. I could almost feel him expecting me to spin back around and start yelling across the yard. Instead, I grabbed my phone, a measuring tape, and a flashlight. I spent nearly an hour photographing every single anchor bolt, every crack beginning to spider through the stucco, every section of conduit crossing onto my property, and several videos showing the vibration inside my bedroom. I even balanced a coin on my nightstand and recorded how it slowly danced across the surface every time the pump cycled into high speed. Before going to bed, I opened the filing cabinet in my office and pulled out something I hadn't looked at in years. The original property survey from 1984 that came with the house when my wife and I bought it. Every setback, every easement, every structural boundary was clearly marked. The firewall wasn't community property. Each side belonged to its respective owner, separated by a legal property line running directly through the center. The next morning, I called an old friend named Daniel Pierce. We'd met years earlier while working on a commercial project. Daniel was a structural engineer, the kind of guy who got excited about concrete cores and vibration testing. When I explained the situation, there was a long silence before he finally said, "Tell me you're joking." I wish I was. He came over Wednesday afternoon carrying more equipment than I expected. Laser level, vibration meter, moisture scanner, thermal camera. He examined the installation with the kind of quiet expression surgeons have before delivering bad news. After about 30 minutes, he stepped back, looked at me, and slowly shook his head. "Whoever approved this shouldn't be approving anything." He explained everything in plain English. The equipment wasn't simply noisy. The continuous vibration would eventually damage finishes, create stress fractures around the anchors, and potentially compromise waterproofing where the masonry had been penetrated. Worse than that, the equipment itself had been mounted onto a structural assembly that wasn't listed in the permit documents for the pole installation. "In short?" I asked. Daniel looked toward the pump and smiled slightly. "He's managed to combine a boundary encroachment with a building code violation. That's actually impressive." I laughed harder than I had all week. Good impressive? Not for him. 2 days later, his formal engineering report landed in my inbox. It was thorough, unemotional, and devastating. Photographs, measurements, decibel analysis, structural observations, applicable code sections. Everything documented exactly the way a city inspector likes to see it. I still didn't contact the city. Believe it or not, I wanted to give Mason one more chance. So I printed the report, walked next door, and knocked again. Brooke answered this time. Unlike her husband, she actually looked nervous. Hi, Ethan. Is Mason home? She hesitated before calling him. He appeared carrying a cup of coffee, smiling like we were old friends again. Back already? He asked. I handed him the report. This explains why the equipment needs to come off my house. He barely glanced at the cover page before setting it on a patio table. I don't need an engineer to tell me how walls work. You probably should read it anyway. He folded his arms. Look, you're making this way bigger than it needs to be. You're right, I answered. It should have been one conversation before you drilled into my house. He rolled his eyes. Everything doesn't have to become legal. I looked at him for a second before replying quietly. Then fix it. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Those pipes are already buried. The electrical's finished. Relocating that equipment would cost me thousands. That's unfortunate. So be reasonable. Reasonable would have been asking first. For a moment, I actually thought he understood. Then he smiled again. The same arrogant smile from the day he moved in. You'll calm down. I left without another word. 3 days later, an email arrived from a law office representing Mason. I expected threats. Instead, I found something almost insulting. They offered me a $300 gift card to a home improvement store if I'd sign a liability waiver acknowledging that I accepted the installation and released Mason from any future structural claims. I read the email twice because it honestly felt like satire. $300. They believed permanent access to my wall, future liability, vibration damage, and legal permission could all be purchased for less than the cost of a decent lawnmower. Caleb nearly spit out his coffee laughing when I showed him the email. He thinks you're negotiating, he said. He's not negotiating, I replied. He's trying to buy evidence before somebody official sees it. That was the moment I stopped treating Mason like a difficult neighbor and started treating the situation like documentation. I replied with exactly 2 attachments: Daniel's engineering report and a formal written demand requiring immediate removal of all unauthorized equipment under the applicable municipal building code, along with notice that failure to comply would result in a complaint to the city's building safety division. No insults, no threats, no emotional speeches, just facts. 2 business days later, I received no response from Mason, but I did receive something much more satisfying. Confirmation from the city's online portal that an inspector had been assigned. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and light rain. Around 9:30, a white city pickup truck rolled slowly into the neighborhood. I happened to be working from home that day, though, if I'm honest, I probably wouldn't have concentrated on work anyway. Inspector Laura Bennett stepped out carrying a clipboard, a tablet, and a portable sound meter. She introduced herself politely, asked me to explain what had happened, then walked directly to the backyard without saying a single unnecessary word. Mason spotted the city truck almost immediately. He came outside smiling confidently, still convinced this was all some misunderstanding that could be talked away with enough charm. Morning, he called cheerfully. Happy to answer any questions. Laura nodded once but didn't engage in small talk. She examined the mounting brackets, measured the property line against the survey I'd provided, checked permit records on her tablet, then placed the sound meter beside my bedroom window while the pump cycled on. For nearly 10 minutes, nobody spoke. The only sound was that relentless mechanical hum vibrating through the wall. Finally, Laura lowered the meter, looked directly at Mason, and asked one question. Who authorized attachment of this mechanical equipment to the adjacent structure? Mason hesitated, just for a second, but sometimes a single second tells you everything. Well, structurally it made sense. She didn't even blink. That wasn't my question. I watched the confidence slowly drain from his face as he realized this conversation wasn't happening on his terms anymore. The rules he had laughed at were now standing in his backyard wearing a city badge, and they weren't interested in opinions. Laura turned her tablet around just enough to compare the permit drawings with what was actually attached to my house. Then she looked back at Mason and spoke in the same calm tone she'd used since arriving. This equipment is installed on the wrong parcel. It's attached to a structure that isn't identified in the approved permit, and the recorded sound level exceeds the residential limit established by municipal ordinance. You'll receive a formal correction notice today. You have 10 calendar days to remove the installation and restore the neighboring property. Mason blinked twice before forcing out a nervous laugh. There has to be some flexibility here. It's already finished. Laura didn't smile. Building code isn't flexible because construction is already finished. He pointed toward me. He's making this personal. Before I could even answer, she interrupted him. No, sir. Your installation made this official. That single sentence landed harder than any argument I could have made. Mason tried another angle, insisting the firewall was basically shared, but Laura opened the survey I'd submitted, traced the legal boundary with her finger, and simply said, "Basically isn't a legal description." Watching him slowly realize he couldn't charm, pressure, or out-talk someone who dealt with facts for a living was strangely satisfying. For weeks he'd acted as though confidence could replace permission. Standing in that backyard, confidence suddenly looked very expensive. After Laura left, Mason stormed across the patio toward me. "You really called the city?" he demanded. "No," I answered honestly. "I gave you every chance to fix it yourself first. This is going to cost me thousands. It didn't have to." He shook his head. "You're unbelievable." I couldn't help smiling a little. "You drilled into my bedroom wall without asking. One of us has definitely been unbelievable." He muttered something under his breath and slammed his sliding door so hard the glass rattled. Ironically, the loudest noise my house had heard all week. The next 10 days were surprisingly quiet. The pump kept running because the correction period hadn't expired, but Mason no longer smiled when he saw me. Contractors stopped showing up. One evening, I noticed him standing beside the equipment with another man who looked like an attorney, both of them studying the mounting brackets in complete silence. I imagined that conversation wasn't nearly as optimistic as the first one had been. On the 10th morning, just after 8, a large white service truck backed carefully into his driveway. 2 technicians climbed out carrying tool bags, ladders, and fresh stucco supplies. I made myself a cup of coffee and watched from my kitchen window without trying to hide it. There wasn't any joy in seeing someone lose money, but there was satisfaction in watching accountability finally arrive. For nearly 3 hours they worked methodically, disconnecting electrical wiring, cutting away PVC piping, removing every heavy anchor bolt one at a time, then carefully patching each penetration in my wall. Every metallic clank echoed like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. Mason stood nearby with his arms folded, speaking only when absolutely necessary. At one point, he noticed me watching through the window. Our eyes met for a second. A few weeks earlier, he would have smirked. This time he looked away first. Later that afternoon, Laura returned for the final inspection. She checked the repairs, photographed the patched wall, confirmed the equipment had been relocated entirely onto Mason's property, then signed the compliance paperwork. As she walked back toward her truck, Mason made one last attempt to save face. "I should probably talk to my attorney about all this." Laura paused beside the driver's door and calmly replied, "That's certainly your right. My advice would be to spend your money on reading the building code first." Then she got in her truck and drove away. I don't think I've ever seen a more complete silence than the one that settled over our little neighborhood after that. For the first time in weeks, I walked into my bedroom and heard nothing. No humming through the drywall, no vibration beneath the floor, no picture frames quietly tapping against the wall, just the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood waking up. Birds in the trees, a lawnmower somewhere down the block, a kid riding his bike on the sidewalk. Funny how you never truly appreciate silence until someone takes it away. It's been almost a year now. Mason still lives next door, although we rarely speak beyond a polite nod if we happen to check the mail at the same time. The relationship never recovered, and honestly, I don't think either of us expects it to. But every now and then I catch myself looking at that smooth section of repaired stucco and thinking about how differently this story could have ended. If I'd reacted with anger instead of evidence, if I'd damaged his equipment, if I'd started a shouting match across the fence, I'd probably have become just another difficult neighbor in somebody else's version of the story. Instead, I took pictures, gathered facts, followed the process, and let people whose job it is to enforce the rules do exactly that. That's a lesson my wife used to remind me of all the time. She'd say, "You don't have to win every argument, Ethan. You just have to choose the right battlefield." She was right then, and she's still right now. So here's what I want to ask all of you. If your neighbor had drilled into your home without permission and then told you to get used to it, what would you have done? Would you have tried to work it out privately longer than I did? Or would you have called the city immediately? Let me know down in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between being a good neighbor and allowing someone to walk all over your property. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-life neighborhood justice stories, and share this with someone who believes property lines are optional, because sooner or later, somebody with a clipboard usually has a very different opinion.